The storm came without warning, but you had already seen its signs, the sky turning steel gray, the wind shifting, the cold crawling up your bones. By the time the blizzard hit, you had no choice but to dig, carve, and pray. 10 nights, below zero. No one would ever know if you survived. Before we ride into this, tell us where you're watching from, and if tales of grit in the wild speak to you, tip your hat to the channel and subscribe for tomorrow's frontier story. Jack rode hard into the Wyoming mountains, the weight of the world pressing against his shoulders. The air, sharp with the bite of winter, seemed to hold its breath as he urged his tired horse forward. The clouds had gathered overhead, a heavy, swollen mass that promised nothing good. Yet Jack rode on. The land was his, and no storm would make him turn back. Not now. His boots, worn and soaked, pressed into the stirrups. His coat flapped against his back like a banner in the wind. His mind had already settled into the rhythm of the journey. Each step was just another mile towards the peace he sought, though the distance ahead was little more than a blur. He had been riding for days, chasing something he couldn't name, running from the same thing: ghosts, memories, guilt, all tangled in the cold, barren earth. Then the wind shifted. It wasn't much, just a subtle change in the direction of the gusts, but Jack knew the land well enough to recognize the warning. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. His horse snorted, its ears flicking nervously. Jack glanced up. The sky was already turning a deep, unnerving gray, as though 1,000 storms were brewing at once. He had no choice but to push on. The town wasn't far now. He could make it, but something in the air told him the storm would come fast, too fast for him to outrun. His gaze flickered to the ridges above, a distant, jagged silhouette against the swirling clouds. He could hear it now, the wind's eerie, howling, the whistle, picking up speed like the growl of a coming predator. When the first snowflakes began to fall, the storm arrived in full force. The wind howled, rattling the bones of the trees around him. Jack's horse stumbled in the deepening snow, its legs giving way to the weight of the drifts. The blizzard closed in, the world around him consumed by swirling white. Jack dug his heels in, urging his horse forward, but the storm didn't care. It bore down with an unrelenting force, and the farther they pushed, the less Jack could see. The path ahead vanished, swallowed by snow and wind. He could barely make out the faint shape of a hill in the distance, the only hint of ground in the endless white expanse. With a curse, Jack veered off the trail, guiding his horse toward a low rock outcrop, something to break the wind, something to hold on to. He dismounted with a grunt, tethering the animal to a nearby tree, then stumbling through the snow toward the shelter. The snow had started to accumulate fast, and Jack felt the weight of it pressing against his legs, the cold creeping through his clothes. He had been through worse. But not like this. Not in the mountains, and not alone. The wind screamed in his ears as he dug through the snow, his hands frozen to the touch of the shovel as he worked. Every movement seemed to sap more of his strength. But there was no choice now, no turning back. The storm had him. The world outside had gone silent, save for the muffled roar of the storm. Jack stood in the dim light, surveying the crude tunnel he had carved into the snow and ice. It wasn't much, just enough to keep the wind at bay. But it was something. It had to be enough. The walls were jagged, rough-hewn with the edge of the shovel and Jack's raw hands. But they would hold, at least for now. The storm raged above, a deafening roar that shook the ground. Jack could feel the weight of the cold pressing in from all sides, but for the moment he was sheltered. He could breathe. He could think. With a heavy sigh, Jack dropped to his knees, the cold seeping into his bones. His fingers were stiff, his body numb, but the fire in his belly refused to die. He had been through worse. The war, the wild winters in Montana, the endless chase for something that always seemed just out of reach. He glanced back at the small entrance of the tunnel, the flickering light from his fire barely illuminating the shadows behind him. Outside, the storm continued its unrelenting assault, the howling winds clawing at the earth like an animal on a hunt. But Jack had faced worse beasts. He could outlast it. He always had. With slow, deliberate movements, Jack unbuckled his belt, pulling free the rifle and the knife that had served him since the days of his youth. His thoughts wandered back to those days, when survival had been a game, when the world had seemed simpler, just a man and the land, no promises, no guarantees. But now, the land had changed. It was a beast unto itself, wild and untamable. The world had come for him, and he had carved out a small piece of it in the snow. His thoughts drifted back to his time in the war, his old comrades. How many had fallen, how many were left? In the cold, his memories often resurfaced, uninvited. His hands trembled as he pulled the flask from his coat, taking a long swig to warm his insides. The fire would keep him alive, but it was the memories that made him feel human. A sudden shift in the air caused Jack to glance up, eyes scanning the darkness. The silence had become deafening. The storm's fury pressed against him like a vice, but the tunnel was solid. It would hold. He had never expected the storm to last this long. He had always thought himself invincible. But even the hardest man could break if the cold was cold enough. He continued to work, carving deeper into the tunnel, making it just a bit wider, just a bit safer. As the hours dragged on, his movements slowed. Every shovel of snow felt like the last. The tunnel was all he had, all he could trust. He glanced at his watch. It had been hours since he last checked, though it hardly mattered now. The minutes blurred, merging together. The fire burned low. Jack stared into its depths, as if searching for an answer he knew wasn't there. No amount of heat could change the reality outside, but the tunnel was his chance. As long as the walls held, as long as the fire burned, he could survive. The rest of the world could freeze for all he cared. Days turned to nights, and Jack felt the cold seep deeper. It wasn't just the biting chill of the snow or the howl of the storm that threatened to swallow him whole. It was the isolation, the deep, bone-rattling loneliness that sat heavy in his chest. 10 days. He'd lost count. His body ached from the effort of keeping the fire alive, but it was the mental strain that was worse. The darkness seemed to press in on him, suffocating the space he had carved out in the snow. He had been alone before, in the war, in the wilderness, but this was different. This was the cold, relentless, and unforgiving. No enemies to face, no distractions, just him and the storm. His breath came in shallow bursts, misting in the frozen air, but he kept digging. Each movement was slower, each breath colder. The tunnel, once an immediate shelter, now felt like a coffin. The walls, hard and icy, seemed to close in around him. There were moments when Jack could almost feel the weight of the storm pressing through the layers of snow above. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. His hands, raw and blistered from digging, shook with the cold, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the winds whipping and howling like a pack of wolves. The snow piled higher, and Jack could feel the pressure building. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. The tunnel was small, barely enough for him to lie down. But it was all he had. The fire, though small, was enough to keep his bones from freezing. But the isolation, that was what wore him down. His mind drifted back to the war, back to the days when he had been part of something larger, back to the men who had fought beside him. But now they were ghosts, just like the land he was trapped in. The memories haunted him, fleeting glimpses of faces and voices that he could no longer reach. He had buried them long ago, just as he had buried so many other parts of himself. And now, all he had left was the endless cold and the tunnel he had carved into the earth. It was all so simple, and yet so fragile. The world outside was falling apart, but Jack had learned to survive in its ruins. There were moments when he could hear the distant howling of the wolves, the deep thrum of the storm, and feel the presence of everything he had lost. He wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the walls. It was the only thing that reminded him he was still alive, still fighting. But the cold was getting harder to ignore. The blizzard raged for nearly 10 days. Jack's small shelter, carved into the heart of the snowdrift, began to feel like a prison. The cold gnawed at him, and every part of his body ached. But Jack's pride refused to let him give up, despite the growing uncertainty that he may not make it out alive. Through the dim light of his dwindling fire, he stared at the walls of his tunnel. The snow had been compacted so tightly it seemed as though it could hold against anything. Still, Jack knew better than to trust it. Snow could deceive you. Snow could bury you. That's what he had learned from the war, and it was true here, too. He clenched his fists, trying to fight the chill in his bones. His fingers had gone numb, his breath shallow, but he couldn't let himself fall into despair. Not now. Not when there was still a chance. Jack had seen this kind of thing before. The silence before a storm broke, the cold that set into your soul, making every movement feel like a battle, and the war. Well, it had been the same way. But that had been different. It had been a fight for something bigger than himself. Here, it was just survival. Just him against the land, the storm, and the emptiness in his chest. His mind wandered, drifting in and out of memories. He thought of his father, of the old days when the fire burned brighter and the nights seemed warmer. He thought of his brothers, how they had all fought side by side in that hell of a war. How they had all believed in something, even when they didn't fully understand what it was. And then he thought of the moment he had lost them, the moment everything had changed. He had carried that loss with him, in the back of his mind, buried deep under layers of snow and grit. But now it was rising to the surface again, sharp and painful. The fire sputtered. Jack cursed softly, throwing another log on the pile, but it didn't seem to do much. The flames flickered weakly, the heat barely enough to fight off the cold seeping through the walls of his shelter. He had started with enough firewood to last a week, but the storm had taken longer than expected. The pile was nearly gone, and with it, any hope of comfort. Jack thought of the mountains outside, the endless white, the unforgiving wilderness that had been his home for so long, the same wilderness that had broken him. The same wilderness that now stood between him and survival. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. His body was weaker with each passing day. His thoughts, foggy and distant, began to blur together, like the snowflakes outside. But even in his exhaustion, there was a part of him that refused to give up. That part of him held tight to the belief that if he could survive this, maybe, just maybe, he could finally find peace. The storm finally cleared. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the world had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Jack opened his eyes to find the fire almost gone, the last embers flickering weakly in the cold air. The walls of the tunnel, now firm and unyielding, stood like a cage around him, a shelter he had carved from nothing but desperation and instinct. He could feel the weight of the storm still pressing against him, though its fury had subsided. The snow outside was deep, untouched, a vast, endless sea of white that stretched as far as he could see. But for the first time in 10 days, Jack felt something other than the gnawing fear and cold. He felt something like a release the tension in his muscles, slowly unwinding. With a groan, Jack pulled himself to his feet, the cold biting at his exposed skin. His body protested, aching from the days spent confined in the small space. But he had made it. He had survived. The reality of it hit him slowly, a quiet acknowledgement that the worst was over. His chest ached, but this time it was from something more than the cold. It was the weight of everything he had carried, the weight of his past, finally lifting, just a little. Stepping out of the tunnel, Jack squinted into the blinding light. The storm had left a blanket of snow over everything, and the sun, a dim pale disk above the horizon, reflected off the ice, making it hard to see. His eyes, still raw from the darkness of the tunnel, had trouble adjusting, but Jack didn't mind. He stood there for a moment, letting the snow crunch beneath his boots, feeling the crisp air in his lungs. His horse was still tied to the tree where he had left it, its coat thick with the snow that had accumulated. It had survived, too. He walked toward it slowly, each step a little more sure than the last. The world was still wild, still unforgiving, but it was different now. The quiet after the storm felt like a kind of peace, like the land had decided to give him one more chance. When Jack reached his horse, he untied the reins and patted its neck. The animal snorted, shaking off the snow, its breath coming in thick clouds. Jack checked the saddle, making sure everything was in place. He had no idea where he would go from here, but he knew one thing: the storm had tested him, and he had survived. He was still here. Turning away from the shelter, Jack swung up into the saddle. The cold wind still cut through him, but this time it was different. It was a reminder of what he had survived, not a threat to his existence. As he nudged his horse forward, the vast wilderness opened before him, untouched and silent, and for the first time in days, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. The mountains were still there, as wild as ever, but so was he.